Hello, Cara.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Um, Really good to get you on the podcast. I know we've been trying to talk about this for a while. The reason I wanted to talk to you is because, well, first of all, of your book, which I finally managed to get hold of and read, The Longest Race, which is here. It's very thought-provoking, for sure, and very poignant with what's happening in the world of sport, in regards to abuse and PEDs as well. Um, so we will get to that and get to that book in detail. But before we begin with that, I just like to ask you what I ask all my guests is your journey up until this point. Like, what made you start running in the first place?
Well, I started running. My grandpa got me into running. He was a lifelong runner. He took me to my first race when I was 6 years old. He was the only one in my family that was a runner. So he really encouraged me to pursue it. And when I was in middle school, I started running more competitively and ended up running for the high school back in the state of Minnesota, the United States, and just kind of went from there, ran the state championship, qualified for some national championships when I was younger, and then got a small scholarship to the University of Colorado, where I became a three-time NCAA champion. And then from there, when I graduated, I signed a contract with Nike and was able to really pursue being an athlete full time. So started really, really small, just running a mile with my grandpa, but it ended up being a whole career.
Okay, cool. So running obviously is great as an activity. I mean, I used to do jogging now. I do more different types of exercise. The difference between that and actually starting to run for pleasure, which to me, I'd get out of breath too much. So, what made you decide to actually think, actually, I can really compete in this? I can really make this into a career.
Yeah, I think I always loved it and I loved the team aspect of it. And obviously I was having success at it. I wasn't always the best, but I was good and I continued to get better. I think when I was at the University of Colorado, I saw people around me that were pursuing it beyond college. So my now husband, Adam Goucher, he was pursuing it. Shane and Alan Culpepper both made Olympic teams. And so I started to see that there was, I mean, I knew that the Olympics existed, but I didn't know that it could be, I had no idea that it could be a full time job, right? Like you just train for a living. So I started to see these people in Colorado that had graduated that were still in Boulder, and I saw them making a living at it and doing it. And I started to think, like, wow, I wonder if I could do that. I wonder if I could be good enough to do that. So, yeah, the thought of being an actual professional athlete and doing it for a living that really started in college.
So, how was your running in college? Because obviously, like, unlike here, university sports in general, they are very competitive. They're shown to a wide audience. How did you just tell us some of your achievements during college? Because I imagine from that to go to where you were at the moment, it must have been nerve-wracking, especially at that level.
Yeah, I mean, my freshman year of college, I was very insignificant. I was like a big fish in a small pond, and now I'm in this big pond, and I'm just a nobody. So, I only qualified for the national championship because my team did in cross country. I didn't qualify in track and field. I didn't at or outdoor. I was just okay, right? I was a varsity runner, but I wasn't a national caliber athlete or anything. And then each year, I just got a little bit better. And by my sophomore year, qualified for the national championship, the track championship, and surprised myself and my coach and everyone by getting second in the women's 3000. That's when they still had the 3000 before the steeple came in. And, for me, it was just validation. I had really bought into this program. My coach, Mark Wetmore, he was really methodical and he thought about development as long term. I remember when I was a freshman, he said, "You're going to walk out of here an All American." I thought, oh, that would be so cool. But I ended up winning three national titles. I won an outdoor 5,000 meter title, outdoor 3,000 meter title, and then the cross country title, which is the bigger of all of them, just because there's so many athletes in cross country. So that's what really set me up then to have the opportunity to be a sponsored athlete and continue on after college.
So, who were your first sponsors when you carried on running after college?
So I signed a contract with Nike right out of college, and I was with Nike for 12 and a half years. So that was, a big deal for me growing up in the United States. Nike's cool, Nike's everything. And so I got an offer. I was talking to a couple different companies, but the offer from Nike came through. It wasn't I mean, I talk about it in my book. I give all the dollar figures. It wasn't like a crazy contract, but it was enough to just train and be an athlete and not have to take on a secondary job. So it was like honestly, it was like a dream come true because I was like, wow, I get to run for a living. That's pretty cool.
Was part of her attraction the fact that, well, especially later on, you got to be trained by Alberto Salazar, who had this reputation as a very good coach. Obviously, Nike are giving him more of his own grounds where he could train athletes. Was that part of the attraction where you thought, actually, I can be trained by someone who's a world class coach? Or was it just a name Nike in itself?
It was just Nike in itself. I always loved the commercials growing up. I was very influenced by the marketing, and I at that point, honestly, to be completely honest with you, I had no idea who Alberto Salazar was. If you said that name, I would have been blank stare at you. For me, it was just an opportunity to continue training. I was going to continue to live in Boulder, Colorado, here where I live now, and be coached by my college coach, who my husband was being coached by. And so at the time, it was just being associated with that powerful brand. Everybody knows Nike. Nike's the cool brand. So it was just that. It was that was just so exciting. Not anyone at the brand in particular.
Yeah. So, what was your first international competition, and how did you get on in that?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. I mean, I started going over to Europe uh, pretty much right away in the summer. I want to say my first year as a professional athlete, I didn't race in Europe. I just raced the US championships and then I had a pretty serious knee surgery. So I didn't race that summer. But the next summer, I think I started going over to Europe. I don't really know. Like the European season is so important because in the United States, track and field opportunities are so limited. And especially back then, now we do have some meets put on, some like some meets that are opportunities to chase qualifying, world standards, Olympic standards, things like that. But there weren't very many opportunities like that at all when I was first coming out. And obviously, I wasn't good enough to run on the top circuit, but Europe has so many opportunities of a B level circuit. So there's a lot of opportunity in Italy and across Europe to get into races and to run PRs. I think there's a lot of opportunity in Belgium too, just to run in these smaller meets and get your times down so that you can be considered for some of the larger meets. So I'm trying to think what my first ever, I think probably my first ever race out of the United States was, I think it was in Greece. I think actually I got into a small meet where I ran the 1500, but it was just like a taste of what it can be, right? Like you get to travel around the world, you get to run in these meets, you get to be around other athletes. And I was super lucky because my husband was doing the same thing. So we would really try. He was a bigger star than me. He had already made an Olympic team and he had already made world championship teams. So he could race at that top level, but he would often come to the smaller meets with me and race an off event. And then he'd go to the bigger races and race. So yeah, I wasn't very good at first, I really took a step back when I graduated from college. I was really overwhelmed by the entire pro scene, and I got injured a lot those first few years. I really struggled actually those first I want to say I signed my contract in 2001, and I really struggled with injury for those first, I would say 4 years or so. So I wasn't no one was paying attention to me. I was going over and running just average times, but for me it was more about the opportunity and the experience.
So, what was that turning point where you went from, like in what you just said, average time, so you thought, actually, I'm getting starting to get into world class now? What was that turning point? Was it a particular meet? Was it a particular year? Like, what was that one point?
Yeah, so I would say we moved from Boulder, Colorado to Portland, Oregon in the fall of 2004 to train with Alberto Salazar, you mentioned earlier, and that was a more professionalized program. And for me, it was really helpful because I had struggled with injuries so much. I was seeing an ART therapist and a massage therapist on a regular basis. I was in the gym more. And I just started to, I mean, I did get injured when we first got there and I had to have another surgery. But after a while, I started to stack, healthy weeks on healthy weeks. And that summer, we went to Europe and I didn't run a qualifying time, but I ran a personal best in the 5,000 for the first time in 5 years. And that's when I thought, oh man, if I can just stay healthy for one more year, I know I can hit all these times. Like they're so close. And if I can just build off of what I did this year. So 2006 was a really big breakthrough year for me where I started running I wasn't necessarily winning meets, but I just started running times that would, allow me to compete at the Olympics or the World Championships if I made it through our system, which is being top 3 at the US Championships.
Right. So just before we get onto the main bulk of the book and what you discuss, over here we have like the lottery system where that's
Mhm.
how athletes are paid. How is that different from the US system, and how, based on that, how much of it was a struggle for you before you went to Nike to get the money to do this like on a full-time basis?
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't have we don't have money coming in from our governing body. I mean, if you get into a certain pool in the United States, you can get some money for your coaching or for medical, but you're not selected. You have to perform to get the money. So it's a little bit, I mean, I know in the UK it's like once you're in, you're protecting your position, but you're in and you're being taken care of. And in the United States, it's kind of like you're rewarded afterwards, if that makes sense. Like you get a check at the end of the year afterwards if you perform well enough. Um, but for me, the Nike situation was a lifeline. I mean, if I didn't have my Nike contract, then I probably would have quit much earlier on because I wasn't making a lot of money running. I wasn't making any money running. And I had medical bills because I was injured all the time. And so without that Nike contract, I probably just would have stepped aside in 2003 or 2004 and said, this just isn't working out. But I was fortunate that I did still have that contract, and it kept me to just keep trying and give it one more year, maybe another year on your contract, just give it one more year. So that in that way, the sponsorship model was really helpful. But I was lucky to sign one right out of college.
Okay, so you get to Portland, Oregon, and you go into this program with Alberto Salazar. In regards to that first year, just from a coaching perspective, how is he as a coach in terms of preparation, tactics, motivation? Just how is he as a coach towards you?
He was great. I mean, it was very new situation. I had been training with my college coach for about 8 years at that point. So it was completely different, new situation. He was really into trying things that at the time seemed crazy, like sleeping in an altitude room or, trying the Alter G treadmill. We had underwater treadmills. So just things that were different that I had never done before. But he was positive. He wasn't super invested in me that first year because he didn't really recruit me. He recruited my husband.
Mm.
And I just was like, oh, I'll coach her too. But I was like, hey, I'm here. I'm getting everything that the guys are getting. I was the only woman on the team. But I was like, hey, I get everything they get. I'm going to use this to my advantage. I'm going to see all the doctors. I'm going to see all the PT. I'm going to do all this stuff and take advantage of being here. So the first year was a little bit unremarkable. I mean, I did have a couple good races in Europe, but I also had a surgery that first year. But I did see Adam, kind of turn his running around, and that was really motivating to me that we were in the right spot. But yeah, Alberto was just encouraging. He was excited to have us, and he kind of was helping us to think bigger again. We both had been struggling for a couple of years, and he was really encouraging us to think bigger and think like we could get back on teams again. We could make teams and we could do well at the international level.
You say that he was trying unconventional things, and I remember reading in a book there was a particular injury you had, and he tried an unconventional treatment. Just to go a little bit of detail about that.
Yeah, I had this thing that was bothering me on my leg, and it turned out I had compartment syndrome, which I had had on a different leg, and I needed surgery, but we didn't know that at the time. And he thought, well, when he was racing, he would use this thing called DMSO, and they use it on racehorses. And it's basically this cream that helps you absorb. And so he had this idea of like, we'll crush up aspirin and then we'll mix it with the DMSO, and then we'll put it on your leg and wrap saran wrap around it. And then we'll leave it, and your body will be able to absorb that aspirin, and that will calm your muscle down, and you'll be fine. I was like, okay, sure, I'm willing to try whatever. But it turned out to be really bad. It ended up burning me and like blistering my skin. And then I had like, now I had a different type of injury. I had a skin injury. So it kind of backfired, but he was always just trying stuff like that. He was open to trying anything. I mean, yeah, I just think back to we ran so much on underwater treadmills. We had the first Ultra G treadmill, which people thought was crazy, and now you see them everywhere. So he was really open. I mean, there were some things that were, he tried that we threw away. He was really into laser treatment for a while and things. He had other things that, didn't stick, right? But he was always willing to try something.
Just going back to that leg injury, and I say this as a naive outsider in terms of track and field, although I like it, I've often not been in that world. But when he's trying that particular treatment on you with aspirin and that powder you talk about, especially with the reputation that athletics has with regards to drugs and athletes having to be very stringent in terms of what they put into their bodies, was there a part of you that thought, oh, hang on a minute, this is something new here. I've never heard of this before. Should this be put on me?
I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit that no. I was so trusting, and I trusted him wholeheartedly. I mean, I trusted him with my life. I trusted him with my career, with everything. So if he told me it was safe and and it was completely legal and it was going to help me, and he believed I needed it, then I was going to do it. And I think that that is, when I look back at that time of my life, that's something that I obviously regret. That not necessarily regret, because I think I was doing the best I could, but it's a little bit embarrassing the way I just took his word at value. I really didn't question anything for many, many years there. Whatever he said to do, I just did it. Looking back, yeah, that makes me very uneasy. I mean, I don't even know what DMSO is. Why am I putting it on my body? I could get drug tested tomorrow, right? And if there's any young athlete listening, I would say, do not do that. I mean, it's just not good. But at the time, I was so, I guess I was kind of naive. I just really trusted everyone around me, and I just didn't question anything. If you tell me it's fine and it's safe, then I believed it.
So under Alberto, similar to questions were asked before, when did those results start to improve? Because you've seen all these weird out of the box ideas, but then I imagine if your results are improving, you think actually it's working in some way, or so I might just continue with it. So when was that point where your results started to improve?
Yeah, so like I said, that year in 2005, I finally broke my 5,000-meter PR that I had had for 5 years, and it wasn't by much. It might have only been by maybe 4 or 5 seconds, but it was enough that it was like, okay, this is working, right? I'm getting back to running the times that made me competitive in the United States. The following year, I ran a lot of personal bests, and I ran under the World Championship standards in 2006. It was small increments again. It wasn't like, I think I went from maybe 15:14 down to 15:09, maybe something like that. So it wasn't like crazy PRs, but they were PRs, they were personal bests, and they were putting me in, I was running under the standards of the World Championships or the Olympics, and it was like, wow, this the reality of, wow, if I can do this again next year and place in the top 3 at the US Championships, I could go to a world championship. And so I really bought in and I honestly just did whatever I was asked, because I was staying healthy. And, even my college coach used to always say, when you stay healthy, you can do anything. And so I was finally staying healthy. And yeah, I was 100% bought in. Whatever he told me to do, I was going to do it.
So what was your, obviously you've described what your relationship with him was at that time, but in terms of what you were seeing in that camp, Albert and his how he was interacting with other athletes, how was that? And was there anyone where you thought, oh, Alberto's not really vibing with that person? And did you think why?
Yeah, it was interesting. We came in and he was already coaching this young athlete, Galen Rupp, and it was made apparent from the very beginning, like Galen is the favorite, which is like didn't really bother us. And then he really was into Adam, my husband, because he saw a lot of himself in Adam, and he had coached, Dan Brown to an Olympic team. He coached Dan Brown to the 2004 Olympic team in 2 events. Actually, he made it in the 10,000 and the marathon, but he had never gotten, and he had coached quite a few men at that point, but he had never gotten someone who was, an NCAA champion or a national champion, that type of talent level. So he was so excited to have Adam. So I mean, he was really, I could tell from the beginning that there was definitely like rings in the group, right? Like it's like the high performers, they get more attention. Uh they're going to be talked about more. They get more attention. They're going to get the best of the best equipment wise. And then it kind of went out from there, like different rings as based on how you were performing. And certainly when we first got there, I was not in that inner ring because I was just this woman that was injured all the time, you know. But I would say as I started to run better, especially after that 2006 season, Alberto started to pay a lot more attention to me. And I kind of got into that inner circle with him and Galen and Adam. And for the most part, you know, it feels good to be on that side. I've never been like the cool kid, so it felt good to be in there. Definitely you could see that he, you know, wasn't as into everyone on the team. And I would say even towards the end of 2006, Adam and Alberto started to butt heads a little bit, which was uncomfortable. And Alberto did not like anyone to challenge him. You know, that was like not a thing. And so at the end of 2006, there started to be a little strife between the two of them. Um, and most of it was over, honestly, NCAA violations that we had seen that made Adam really uncomfortable, and Alberto asking us to lie about them if we were asked about it. That kind of stuff just like really bothered Adam. And you know, at the time I kept telling myself, well, it's not that big of a deal. It's not really hurting anyone. But looking back, I feel like that was sort of the beginning of maybe a little bit of manipulation of me starting to justify behavior that I knew was wrong. And that just became, you know, more egregious over time.
So if Alberto's butting heads with your husband, obviously because you're a married couple, did Alberto then take it out on you, or did he just not do at all? Or in fact, did he give you more attention as a
He
result?
gave me more attention. I would say that it actually, yeah, he definitely gave me more attention, started paying attention to me more, you know, was there for more of my workouts and lifting sessions, more concerned about my health and all of my stuff happening outside of practice. So he didn't take out his frustration with Adam. He didn't take it out on me. If anything, it made him care about me more.
Okay. So he's focused on you more, you're getting all these results. Okay, the relationship between him and, and your husband is not great,
No.
but in terms of yourself, you're doing well. And then you start to see more and more things that make you think, hang on a minute here, this is something's not quite right. How difficult was it, before we get into detail, how difficult was it for you to keep on putting those things at the back of your mind, bearing in mind that you're doing well and you don't really want that train to stop?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge part of it is like I'm really good at comp- compartmentalization, excuse me. So like putting things to the side. I think I developed it pretty young. My father died when I was really little, and I think I learned at a really young age how to put aside hurt that doesn't help me. And not that that's good for you, but I think I was really, really good at that. Like if I think about my dad dying, that hurts really bad. So I'm just going to put it over here and I'm never going to let that hurt me. And I got really good at that through athletics. Like, um, I have to do this workout. It's going to hurt so bad. I have to be able to ignore this pain because that doesn't help me get what I want. And I think that in this situation with Alberto, you know, I saw things that made me very uncomfortable, right? Like I mean, it didn't make me uncomfortable. Like I saw testosterone cream, for instance, and he told me it's for my heart. And I just said, okay, box, put it aside. Because if I question it, that nothing good will come from that, right? And then I also saw syringes in the refrigerator with liquid in them. He told me they were allergy shots. I just said, okay, and I think as I look back, I was really justifying a lot of things and compartmentalizing it because if I actually said, well, why are the allergy shots in the refrigerator? Shouldn't those be at the doctor's office? And why are there so many? Then I risk, you know, Alberto getting mad at me. Maybe won't coach me anymore. Maybe, you know, some sort of strife. And then I lose everything that I'm working for. I mean, this is like my whole life. My whole life's dreams is to go to the Olympics. So I can't question it. I'm just going to accept what he tells me. Questioning stuff doesn't help me, it only hurts me. And yeah, again, that's stuff that I look back at now with a lot of therapy and a lot of time, and I realize how unhealthy that was. But that's how I was getting through it, and that's how I was wired at the time.
One of the things that I found bizarre in the book is if, say, there was an issue with you, say, injury wise, or even psychology wise, and you called Alberto about it, he would say, right, come down to mine straight away now. He wouldn't necessarily recommend you with a doctor. And I was reading what developed as a result of a couple of interactions, and I was thought, oh, okay, this is just just don't go there. Like there was one, if you don't mind talking about it, with I think a particular massage, if I'm correct. Um, Obviously you don't have to go into detail, but explain just what happened there.
Yeah, so Alberta, when I first joined the team, Alberta would massage athletes, at training camp or uh if we were at Europe, and Adam and I thought it was weird at first. We thought, "Oh, that's weird." I mean, we have paid massage therapists on staff. Like, why is he giving people massage? Why is he giving us massage? But nobody acted like it was weird. Everyone just did it, would just let him do it. And so after a year or two, it just didn't even cross my mind that that's weird anymore. Like, I didn't even cross my mind that's inappropriate. Your coach shouldn't be giving you massage. And one of the very first trips that he and I took together when I was running well, um, and he and I think it might be the first trip that we ever traveled alone together. We went to Helsinki. I was going to run a 10,000. No, no, no. I'm sorry. We went to Riyadh. I was running the 1,500. This was after that. So it wasn't our first trip together. It was our second trip. Anyway, I was running the 1,500, and he says, I want to give you a pre meet massage, and I say sure, and I don't even think anything of it, and it just felt wrong. I just knew it was wrong. I knew that he was like just touching me in a way that shouldn't be happening, but I didn't say anything. I just sat there and let it happen. And, again, this was early on. This was in 2006, and he coached me until 2011. And I think it just shows how you really you justify things in these situations. I mean, I remember thinking at first when he left, I was really upset. But then I convinced myself that he didn't do anything wrong, that it was a mistake, and that actually I was the person at fault for even thinking he would do something like that. So again, it was like this mental gymnastics to get to a point where I could be okay because I need to go out tomorrow and perform. And I did. I got up the next day and I performed and I got the job done. And I think it's kind of like what we're just talking about. You're in these situations, it's so intense. Your whole not only does your livelihood depend on it, but your dreams do as well. And he's everything. I mean, he's my coach, he's my mentor. He decides if I'm on this team or not. He decides if I get paid or not. And so I just had to have full faith and trust in him, because otherwise if I opened up those cracks and started to question, then I could lose everything.
Yeah,
I don't know.
it's very difficult. And on top of that, you say he was drinking a lot. I mean, a
A
lot. I
lot.
mean,
Yeah.
that's something where, as much as someone could be good at compartmentalization, that's something where you could smell it on their breath.
Oh yeah.
So I'm just wondering, how on earth do you take that to one side? Because you could probably take it to one side, and then if he's talking to you, you're going to smell it. So, I mean, all these little signs, I'm just thinking it must have been difficult for you to really put that to one side, no matter how good you are at doing it.
Yeah, I mean, but for a long time I would just was okay, right? Then it finally starts to crack. But for a long time, look, I mean, I don't have a father. I think that's a not a weakness that I don't have a father, but probably something I've always searched for is a father figure in my life. And he was filling that role. And he was telling me how much he loved me, how much he thought God brought him into my life for this reason, to be a father figure. He was calling my mom and telling her the same thing. God brought me into her life. I'm supposed to be a father for her. And look, people are flawed, right? And he had a problem with alcohol, but it didn't, he was like controlled, like he would wait till 5 p.m., if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so that was the way I justified it. It was like, well, it's most of the training is done now, and that's just his thing. That's his way that he blows off steam. And, I didn't grow up around alcohol at all. And so it was different, but I just tried to, I was really good at just being like, no one is perfect. He has his own flaws. He has his own things that have happened in his life that he would share. And I would really just like give these excuses to his behavior. Of course, now that I look back, your coach should not be drinking around you. Your coach should not be inebriated around you. That is just wildly, wildly inappropriate. But at the time, I'm thinking, well, I'm an adult and he's an adult, and my training is done for the day. So what does it matter if he's drinking? It doesn't really affect me. And that's just how I would talk to myself.
And yet, as I said before, your results were improving because you were
Yeah.
going to the World Championships, Olympic
Mhm.
Games. What was you like during those events?
I think the first World Championships that I ran at in 2007, everything was good. I mean, he had had his heart attack in the weeks leading up to it, and I think all of us, my husband was on the team that year, Galen Rupp was on the team, and I think there was just this feeling of gratitude and thankfulness, and I just went in there and it was my first ever world championships and I'm just running and I'm really open-minded to what could be. I'm feeling just so thankful that he's alive. And I have this huge breakthrough race where in the moment I get third and I get the bronze medal, which is later upgraded. But that was like a blessing and a curse, I think, because at the time, we used to get these pep talks of it's impossible to be the best all the time. What we train for is a window of opportunity. When that window is there and it opens, we are going to be there to go through there. After Osaka World Championships, all of a sudden there became this expectation and medals were talked about and things like that were talked about where before it was we always talked about opportunity. And then after Osaka at the World Championships, we only were told like how many medals we needed to bring home and we need to bring home more medals. So I think that was a shift in the culture of the team, to be really honest with you. I feel like me winning that medal was, like I said, it was a double-edged sword. It was great and it was exciting. And I started to get paid a lot more and I could get into any race I wanted after that. The opportunities from that were incredible. But personally, in our team, the culture of our team really changed to having high expectations of what would happen at these big meets.
Wasn't one of the ironies at one of his major events that after a race, he said that I think it's two athletes ahead of you or in the same field, he actually called them, basically said that they were dirty
Mhm.
while this was happening. I mean, that seems a real, very cognitive dissonance from him.
Yeah, I mean, what's crazy about that is that in 2007, I finished third, and he said, "You're going to be silver medalist," because he believed the woman that was second was dirty. And it's wild. Like way things happen in the world is wild. Is that much later, when I had no relationship at all with Alberto anymore, they retested our samples, and Elvin Ablagasse's sample did test positive for stanzanol, and I was upgraded. But he before that he didn't really talk about people being dirty. He was really would talk about windows of opportunity. After Osaka, he would openly talk about who he thought was cheating. And like I said, it was just a definite culture shift. But yes, in Osaka, we were sitting there, and he said, "I know she's dirty." And he said it at the New York City Marathon too. The following year. So he had no problem, not out loud saying this person is dirty, but privately telling me who he thought was clean and who wasn't.
As much as you say you're good at withdrawing pain and compartmentalizing, it's, how can I describe it? If it's happening for so long, there must have been a point where you think, I've reached out to someone, even if it's privately. But correct me if I'm wrong, up until the point where you thought, I can't do this anymore, you didn't. If so, why? Because surely there must be a point where you must need a release valve somehow. I know people can compartmentalize a lot of stuff, but there must be a point where you think, this is just too much, even for me.
I didn't share with anybody anything. I always lied and said that everything was great. And I had one teammate, Amy Begley, and she and I opened up to each other a little bit, but not all the way. So we would share some of our frustrations or concerns. But even then, we were holding, our cards to the chest a little bit. No, I just kept it inside. I mean, like again, I have a lifetime of experience of this, of just holding painful things in and not telling anyone. And it really, I had my breaking point. There were things building after I had my son in September of 2010. And when I returned from having my son, there were kind of things building for months, but really, it was just, I had my breaking point, and it wasn't because I said, I can't take this. I wasn't because I said, I think this group is unethical and I don't want to be associated with it. Or, it wasn't something like that. It was just like an incident on a plane where he came on to me. And that was my breaking point. I just felt so degraded and disappointed. And I think up until then, I could kind of push everything aside and make up an excuse for it. But in this instance on the plane, there's nothing I could do to make it make sense. or explain it away. Like, it was very clear that he was coming on to me, right? And that was really the breaking point. I remember going in the bathroom and crying and thinking like, I have lied and defended this person and affected my own marriage and my own relationships with people because I thought that he loved me as a father and that I needed him in my life. And I just can't believe it. Like, I cannot believe how much I've protected him over the years and for this, like, I just felt so upset. And so it's kind of embarrassing, but that was actually the breaking point, not all the other things that I saw and witnessed.
What you describe as happened on the plane isn't one of the problems with that situation that, unlike say if it was on the ground, there literally is no escape unless it's
Yeah.
a big enough plane and you can sit down and there literally is no escape. So I imagine it must have been very hard once it happened just to get it out of your head because you can't escape anywhere. It's not as you could
No.
jump in the car and just go anywhere.
I couldn't go anywhere. Obviously, we're flying from the United States over to Asia. And then when we get there, I have a newborn at home. And so my husband was only flying in for 24 hours just to see me race. And so I have to survive the next 5 days with him. And it was the worst experience of my life, honestly. It was just, I mean, until my son got sick about a month ago. But at that point, it was the worst experience of my life. I'm so on edge. When I came back to the plane seat after I had been in the bathroom crying, he was asleep, or at least he was acting like he was asleep. He had a baseball cap pulled down over his head, and he stayed that way the rest of the flight. And when we landed, he said, "Wow, I got so drunk. Do you remember what we were talking about?" And I said, "No, I don't remember," because I was scared. Even though I was a grown woman, a mother, I was scared of like, what if I say, "Dude, you hit on me." Like, I just don't know where this is going to go. And so those 4 or 5 days in Daegu were just horrible. I was so on edge. Um, I was crying a lot. Every time I would FaceTime Adam, I'd be crying, but I didn't tell him what happened. I was like, we need to get out of here. I don't want to tell my husband in a foreign country. And then he goes and, says something to Alberto, and I was still it was still just rattling around in my brain. Like, that just happened. How did I get here? How did I let him think that was okay? Or let him think that he could talk to me like that. Yeah, it was horrible. It was really horrible. And it wasn't until, I on the way to the airport when we left, that's when I told my husband I'm leaving the team. But I didn't even tell him why. It wasn't until I got home and I talked to my family and they said, "You have to tell him." But that's how I don't want to say brainwashed, but just how controlled I was at that time in my life, of just the fear of disappointing my coach rather than my entire life outside of him.
From what I remember reading in the book, he said there were a couple of young athletes who arrived at that camp and then they left early. And didn't you say he expressed regret because it later turned out that they'd been going through similar to what you've been going through? I can't remember their names.
With the training group in
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
particular. Yeah, yeah, I felt a lot of responsibility. I One of the athletes I reached out to and she didn't want to meet, which I understand. The other athlete, I never reached out to her. And of course, I know her and she's a part of my life, but I just, and now I felt guilty. I was worried, but I also had been portrayed as this, you know, I don't know what Alberto told all the other athletes when I left. But I know that he made me look like I was crazy, or that Adam was forcing me to leave or something like that. So they didn't want to hear from me. But yeah, looking back, I feel bad. I feel like I could have probably helped a lot of heartache in that program.
So what is the leaving process like? Because you're still under contract with Nike, they're still paying you money. I imagine you and your husband have a mortgage to pay. How on earth did that process go? Because as difficult as it was to walk away, you've still got to make up the funds somehow, and you've still got a career to think of. So how did that process develop?
Yeah, I mean, leaving Alberta was the first step. So I told my husband I was going to leave, but I wanted to tell Alberto in person. So I waited until he came back from Europe because he went to Europe after the World Championships. I had been injured, so I came straight home. So we met face to face. He had the team sports psychologist there. My husband had offered to come with me, and I said, "No, this is between Alberto and I. And when I got there, the sports psychologist was there, and they were talking to me like, "You don't really want to do this. You don't really want to leave." Um, but I knew I was leaving. That was a difficult process because um, I had no idea the way that our program had been looked at by other people. And so as I started talking to other coaches, I found out that a lot of other coaches, some were interested, but their athletes didn't want me to be there. Some weren't interested because they just assumed I had crossed a line, an ethical anti-doping line, and that was a huge wake up call. So finding another coach was really difficult. It really made me question, should I even keep running? Like if no one wants to work with me and they think this. But I was fortunate enough to finally land with Jerry Schumacher at the time. But leaving Alberta was difficult because again, this is a person who's controlled every aspect of my life for the last 7 years. So I met with him, told him I was leaving. But then there was this series of phone calls and emails where he would call and try to get me to stay. And then finally he, sent me an email a couple weeks later saying like, okay, I can tell you're leaving. I agree. That's fine. You've been strong about it the whole time. I just wanted us to make up or whatever. And that's when I felt like I could finally move forward. I mean, I wasn't even talking to other coaches yet because I wanted to give him the grace of talking to him first. So the first process was just switching coaches and removing myself from that situation, but I was still under contract with Nike. And that's another thing. It's like I couldn't say why I left because he's beloved. I mean, he's the coach of the Nike Oregon Project. He's the coach of Mo Farah and Galen Rupp and all these people who are running so well. He has a building on the Nike campus. So I'm disposable. He's not, right? And now
Mhm.
I have a child and a mortgage and real life things that I need to have my job for, let alone just my own dreams that I have that I've worked so hard for. So those first couple years was just very, I guess it was maybe just a year and a half or so because it was just very quiet, make the Olympic team, put your head down, get the job done. And I got injured in 2013 and I broke my foot. And I knew that Nike would suspend me without pay if I let. So in our contracts, you have to, if once you start making a lot of money, there's like restrictions, which I understand. But one of mine was I had to race so many times per year and I couldn't let so much time, 120 days lapse between competitions. So I broke my foot and I was cross training like crazy. And I went back in at about 9 weeks post the first MRI and I get another MRI and my foot hasn't healed at all. And now it's official. Like I'm not going to run anymore this year and I'm definitely going to get suspended without pay. But I knew Nike would do that. So what I did is I just went out and ran. I ran sanctioned races, even though my foot was still broken, and I met my requirement. And Nike caught on to what I was doing, but they didn't know I had gone to do one in Washington. I hadn't told anyone. I just drove up there with my husband and my son, did the race. We had chip timing, and then the chip timing failed. And I went to the meet director, and I'm like, I need the results from this race. Like, and he was like, well, yeah, you won. And I'm like, no, 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 no. And this needs to be official. This is an official meet. I need the results. And so he ended up posting them on a website. And when Nike reached out to me, because they realized what I was doing and they said, we realize that you're fulfilling your contract as far as meet wise, but unfortunately you let 122 or 123 days lapse. So we're not gonna pay you for 123 days. And once you've paid us back, then we can renegotiate a new contract. But they didn't know I had run this other race. And so when I was able to send them those results, I was out of my contract because I had met all the requirements and I was able to leave. And they had said in that email, we're not going to take the option year. So contract stuff, they could have held me for one more year. But in this email, they said, we're not going to hold you to this year. We're going to have you make up the 120 plus days. And when you're done with that, then we'll just start all over again and renegotiate. And by saying that in writing that they weren't going to take that year and me being able to prove that I had in fact raced, I was able to leave. And, it was bittersweet, right? Because it wasn't the brand I had believed in and I wanted to leave, yet my whole life was built around the brand. All my friends, everyone I associated with worked at Nike, trained at Nike, or was an employee there. And so it was like, okay, I'm free. I don't have to run for this brand anymore. But it was also like, wow, now my life is really going to change because everyone that I live and breathe with, aside from my husband and son, are related to Nike somehow, and now I'm leaving all of that.
Just quickly before we continue, because I know you obviously developed with something more. You talk about you had to raise so many times in like 120 days. With that contract, was there a maternity clause in that contract? And also, was it actually, how can I describe it? Were there certain things which you look back now and you think, actually, if you had a good lawyer or had before a lawyer, you'd be able to tear that contract to shreds?
Oh, absolutely. There was no, the word maternity or pregnancy was not in the contract anywhere. And so I always knew I wanted to have a child. I was very open with that with Alberto. He actually helped me determine when was the best time to have a child. He said, it's after you get your marathon career started, have this child, and then you'll have plenty of time to come back for the Olympics. And since there is nothing about pregnancy, there is now, but then there was nothing about pregnancy or maternity leave in the contract. So my husband had asked when I first signed with Nike, what happens if she wants to have a baby? And I remember being mad at him because I was like, don't tell them that. They're going to think I'm just going to get pregnant, not be a real athlete. And he was actually forward thinking because he was thinking, well, you're going to run for a long time. At some point, you're going to want to have a child, you know? And at that point, they told us, oh, no, we don't talk about that. It's on a case by case basis. So when I decided to try to have a baby, Alberto helped me pick the time. And I just said, hey, I just want to know what's going to happen with my contract. So he went to John Capriati, who was the head of sports marketing. He's no longer has that role, but he's still very involved in sports marketing at Nike. He went to John Capriati and he said, don't even go there. As long as she does all the appearances we ask her to do and she stays relevant, everything will be fine. Great. So I did so many appearances while I was pregnant. Um, I ended up having to make a list because of what ended up happening. I made like 20 some appearances for Nike. I was all over the place, right? Um, and I got paid quarterly, just direct deposit. So it was my July payment or my June payment, and it never came. And my financial advisor actually told me, hey, your payment didn't come through. So I reached out to my agent. My payment never came. He said, it's probably just European season. People are busy. I'll get back to you when I finally talk to him. Well, he finally got back to me a couple weeks later and he said, you're suspended and they don't know for how long. And I said, for what? And he said, your medical condition. So they refused to use the word pregnancy in anything. And even when we did resolve the issue, I'll use air quotes, even in that, they still didn't say your pregnancy. They said your medical condition. So what ended up happening was they said that they weren't going to pay me for 18 months. I said, that's absolutely crazy. I was on the cover of magazines, things that they set up while I was pregnant. Um, they finally reduced it down to a year. I still thought that's not fair. So basically, I was going to be suspended for a year without pay. So I'm going to run and race for Nike. I'm going to do all of the appearances. I'm going to be held to this standard of having to be ranked top 3 in the US or top 10 in the world. I'm going to have to race so many times, but I'm not going to receive a dime from Nike during this time. And because I'm an independent contractor, I can't say, hey, Adidas, during this time, can I run for you? Because now I'd be breaking my contract with Nike and I'd have to pay them back even more. So I did start to look for a lawyer because I was like, this is crazy. This cannot be legal. And it was such a frustrating process. My husband and I would talk to a lawyer. They'd say, absolutely, they cannot do this. I know you're not an employee, but there's still rules and laws. And then they come back and say, hey, Nike has us on retainer. We can't work with you. And they'd refer us to someone else. And this went on and on. Finally, we found a lawyer who was not on retainer with Nike. And all that she had me do was like compile a list of all the things I had done during that time. Anyway, long story short, Nike found out I had this lawyer and said, well, how about 6 months suspension, but we add a year to your contract. And at this point, I was so tired. I mean, I'm racing the Boston Marathon. I'm doing all these races and I'm not getting paid. And at this point, I just said, fine, I'll do it. I'll just sign it. And my husband wanted me to fight it, but they just wore me down. And so I signed this contract, which extended my contract till the end of 2013. And then I had to go 6 months without pay. And in that extended contract, they referred to it as a medical condition, not a pregnancy.
I'm sitting here stunned, but in a way I shouldn't be because I've heard stories like this, both US and UK, from further back where they'll put these contracts in and think, oh yeah, we'll get away with it. And yeah, inevitably you just end up being shocked. Like we've got Jane Couch, she was like the first, because I'm a boxing fan, like the first um female boxer to get a license here. And you read a court case of what happened with her and what the officials were saying about her. And I was just thinking, it kind of reminds me of that. It's like these excuses. I just think, just from a moral perspective, because this is what,
Right.
just over 10 years ago, I just scratch my head and think you must have looked at it and think it's absurd, but obviously, like you say, you didn't have the money nor the resources to really fight it.
Right. I mean, I will say that during this time, I reached out to other women, and other women had across a bunch of sports at Nike had gone through the same thing. So I was not unique in any way, shape, or form. I think what felt so like extra gross to me was how they were promoting me as you can have it all. They announced my pregnancy on the cover of the New York Times on Mother's Day on the cover of the sports section. They did that. I didn't do that. The New York Times didn't come to me. Nike orchestrated that. I think about the Runner's World covers and all the other covers and articles that I did. And I think that's what made it feel extra egregious is just you were promoting this lifestyle and then behind the scenes you were punishing me for it, you know? But I would be lying if it was like just me. It was so many women that this happened to. And it was really interesting because this was 2000, my son was born in 2010. And I would often say I would say something to a reporter. I'd say, well, they didn't pay me. And they'd say, what? And then but it would go nowhere. And it wasn't until 2018 when Alicia Montano, who's a track athlete, and Allison Felix, who's obviously the most decorated track athlete of all time, when they were willing to go forward with their stories, that companies finally started. I mean, some companies had pregnancy clauses, but most didn't. And it wasn't until 2018 when people were like, "Wait, what?" And that's when I felt like I could finally say what happened to me without. Even then, I got people saying, "So you were just sitting around at home eating ice cream and you thought you should get paid?" You know, and I'm like, you're missing the point. I
Yeah.
wasn't sitting around at home eating ice cream, you know. But fortunately now contracts have changed, and Nike was the last to change in the track and field world, but they did. And so now there is protection for women that are running and competing now. Thank goodness, because it's just crazy, right? It's like at the time I felt like I'm going crazy. Like I was meeting with Nike execs. I went all the way to the CEO at the time, Mark Parker. I had written on the Nike jet with him a couple of times. I considered him a friend. And I just said, they're not going to pay me. And he stood by company policy over any sort of ethical standard. He was just like, I'm whatever they say is what I'm going to support. So I felt at the time, and then that shuts you down because you start to think, well, maybe I am wrong here. Maybe women shouldn't get paid, um, which obviously isn't right. But they wear you down. I got worn down a lot.
Just quickly before we forward it back to your story and what happened there, tell me about this sports psychologist, because he seems to be using psychology which I've never heard of, or more folk psychology.
Yeah, well, it turns out he's not a psychologist. It turns out when I was writing my book, we found out that his degree was actually not in psychology at all. He had a degree in physiology, I believe. But he was brought in as this guy who's going to save us. You know, I think Galen Rupp was struggling a little bit. This would have been in at the end of '06 into '07 that he was brought in. Galen Rupp was obviously a great runner, but he hadn't won an NCAA title yet. And he was brought in to help Galen mentally get tougher. And then Galen did really well. And so it became a requirement that anyone on the Oregon Project had to work with Darren Treasure. And we were told he was a sports psychologist. Runner's World wrote an entire article about Darren and I where he was referred to as a sports psychologist the whole time. He never corrected them or anything. But it turns out he's not a sports psychologist. But we had to work with him. It was part of being on the team. And, I didn't mind it, especially at first. It was a place for me I've always had race anxiety. I've always had a little bit of imposter syndrome. I don't come from this super athletic family or that certainly a family that knows anything about track and field. They do now, but I didn't come from a family that knew about it. And I always had this little bit of imposter syndrome of like, how did I end up here? Like, I'm just a girl from the woods. Like, literally, I grew up in the woods in northern Minnesota. And so it was good at first for me to talk to him about I've done these big things and people think I'm this great athlete, but I don't even believe that I'm this great athlete. Like, I don't even know how I got here. So there were things at first that were really helpful with him. Um, but thing as things do, things started to shift, and we would he would talk about other athletes, and then I would find that I would tell him things, and then Alberta would bring them up to me. Like his big thing was like, "You're Kara fucking Goucher. Like, why are you crying right now?" But it was a requirement. I mean, you couldn't, if you said I don't want to see him, then you couldn't be on the team. But he became so important and powerful that, in fact, he would be the last person you would talk to before you go to the start line. You would talk to Alberto, and then you would talk to Darren, and then you would go to the starting line. So he definitely had a lot of power on the team, and he got paid very well.
So fast forwarding to where we were before, obviously you've left Nike, you've well kind of been sorted out, and you got a new coach. Well, two things. One, how is it without a new coach? What was the main differences? And two, you had a new sponsor as well, I believe.
Mhm.
So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when I realized I was going to be released from my Nike contract, I just happened to be visiting Boulder, Colorado, where I went to college. And I just happened to be here. My husband and I had flown out. They were hosting the Pac 12 cross country championships. And a bunch of the alumni had just said, let's go and support the team. So it just happened to be here when all of that went down, and when the lawyer said, you're free from Nike if you want to be. And I hadn't talked to my coach in years, like I left and I went on and had this whole career without him. And he didn't think I should leave, and he certainly didn't think I should go to Alberto Salazar. This is my college coach, Mark Wetmore, and I really hadn't had a relationship with him in a very, very long time. And I just happened to see him out that night after the meet. And I said, hey, would you ever think about coaching me? And he was stunned, right? I mean, we haven't talked in like 8 or 9 years or something. Um, and he encouraged me to come to practice the next day, and I did. And then we just started talking, and I just felt like, I know I only have one more Olympic cycle left in me. I don't want to start over with someone I don't know. I want to go back where someone that I know believes in me, and he had already developed me as from a nothing collegiate runner to an NCAA champion. And so we moved back to Boulder, Colorado at the beginning of 2014. But I had no sponsor. Yeah, I had no sponsor. We moved into a little apartment. We sold our house in Portland and just started renting this apartment, trying to figure out what to do. And I started meeting with shoe companies, but I felt like every time I left a meeting with a shoe company, it was like Nike, only smaller. A lot of lip service, like, we're here to empower women. And yet it would be five men talking to me. And I just kind of felt like I'm tired of this. Tired of this cycle. Like, I want to be, if I'm going to go with it, if people want to talk about empowering women, I want them to be women. And that's what happened. I met with this tiny little brand called Wazel. It was just apparel company, but it was founded, owned, and operated by all women. And I just fell in love with this brand. And I went on a visit. They're based out of Seattle, Washington, fell in love with it even more. And then they broke my heart and said, we could never make you an offer. We could never come close to paying you at all what Nike's paying you. So I was really devastated and started meeting with other brands again. And then my husband, Adam, just called him and said, make her any offer. So they just made me a little tiny offer and partner ownership in the brand. And I ended up signing with them as the best decision I ever made. I mean, I've been with them for 11 years and I'm still with them. They still support me.
So have they grown as a company? Because you say the whole boards are women. So from what you were saying before, they're very small. Have how much have they grown, or have they stayed the same?
They have grown. I mean, it's still a small brand and still a small company, but yes, it's definitely grown since I've been there. And what's been cool for me is that they supported me when I was trying to make a third Olympic team, and they support me now just loving the sport, and they support women of all walks of life and levels, right? Like, they have their elite athletes that are, they've had a couple people make an Olympic team. Um, but they also support just someone who just wants to run and has never done it. Right. And so that, for me at this point in my life, has become really important, because obviously I do not compete anymore. But it was a huge change to go from the Nike jet to Wazel, where it was like, oh, we can't afford a plane ticket. You're going to have to take the train and just all sorts of stuff. But it was totally worth it.
Oh, cool. So later on, and it wasn't just what your story or even your sport, but all these allegations of PEDs and abuse were happening in other sports as well, and you had to go to court and speak about it. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there was a couple different cases. The first case was USADA versus Alberto Salazar and Dr. Jeffrey Brown, who was a team doctor we had. It wasn't me versus them. It was them finding evidence that anti-doping rules had been broken. And I had to go and testify for both of those hearings. Um, in those hearings, both Dr. Brown and Alberto, those are two separate hearings, but the results were announced at the same time. The American Arbitration Association banned them both for 4 years. They both immediately filed an appeal. So we went through it again in front of the Court of Arbitration of Sport. So then I had to go testify again in front of the Court of Arbitration of Sport. While that was going on, people filed a Safe Sport report, which is Safe Sport is an organization in the United States. It's funded by the US Congress, and it's to protect athletes in sport. And it protects against mostly sexual abuse in sport. And someone had filed a report with Safe Sport. When Safe Sport first came to me, I did not want to be involved. I didn't want to talk about the stuff that I had experienced. It's embarrassing. I was a grown woman and I didn't say no and I didn't fight back. Um, and so when Safe Sport first came, I said, no, I have no interest in being a part of your case. But then another athlete that was coached by Salazar, by Alberto, filed with Safe Sport. And I kind of thought maybe this is my chance to make up for not doing the right thing all those years ago. Not talking to her all those years ago. And I really started to think about my nieces too and other women that I feel like would have reacted the same way I did, which was just let it happen and not say anything. And so I ended up testifying in the Safe Sport hearing where he ended up being banned for life. And then he appealed that decision. And so we had to go again in front of the court again for the second hearing. And that one was, the first time it wasn't that bad because I was protected. I didn't have to see him. The second time was much more intense and it was more like a trial. So his lawyer was asking me questions and um, it was just a really horrible experience. But at the end of the day, he was still banned for life. So what that means is his doping ban is up, so he could coach at the NCAA level or at the sub elite level or anywhere else than the United States. But this with the Safe Sport ban, he can't coach at the Olympic level in the United States. But it only falls under that small jurisdiction, Olympic level in the U.S.
Well, that'll be a disadvantage for him in the next Olympics because obviously it's LA, so he won't be able to coach in there at all. Is that
No.
correct?
Yeah, I mean, certainly no U.S. athletes, and because it's being held there, I don't think he'd be able to be there because it would be a meet in U.S. soil. So, um, it's sad. It's not like I feel happy about it. I know how much he loves coaching, but but the truth of the matter is he shouldn't be coaching. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
indeed. So that's happened, and what are you doing now? What's Carol what you doing now? Because obviously when we spoke to try and arrange this, you said I think you were commentating on the Olympics in Paris. So
Mhm.
is that your main thing now, media work, or if not, what else are you doing?
Yeah, so my son would tell you that his mom has a million jobs, but basically I'm just still in running, right? So I still am sponsored by Wazelle, so I still do a lot of events building up women's running. I'm sponsored by Brooks Running now for footwear, so I do a lot with Brooks with youth running because I'm really passionate about youth running. Obviously, I have a child. I am on the board of USADA, which is the United States Anti-Doping Organization here in the United States. So I go to Congress and I go to the Capitol and ask for more funding and talk about the challenges of being a clean athlete in the system we have. And then, yes, I work for NBC. I'm the distance analyst for track and field. So for like U.S. championships, the world championships, Olympics, things like that. You don't hear it because you're not here in the United States. But if you listen to the United States, it's my voice, any race 1,500 meters and up. And then I also host a podcast with Des Linden, who's a big runner here in the United States who won the Boston Marathon. And we host a podcast together called Nobody Asked Us, where we just talk about running related things. So a lot of random stuff, but basically anything running related, I love it. And I still want to be involved.
It's an absolute pleasure talking to you. If people want to find out more about what you do and where to buy the book, where can they go to?
You can just follow me on Instagram. Honestly, that's the best place at Kara Goucher, and there's a link there to buy the book. And that's where I post the most and update the most. That's the best place to follow me.
Of course, it'd be an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I'm glad that everything, obviously I'm not glad everything happened, but I'm glad that we're able to talk about it. And things seem to be going in the right direction. So thank you so much for coming to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.